And a very pleasant good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whenever you might be listening to the QCast. And welcome to season 2, episode 12. I feel like all of these episodes are exciting for me, and I've loved all the guests that I've had. I'm really excited today to talk to two guys that I have interacted with a ton over the last several years, and I've never met either one of them until this very moment. And that's one of the great things about this little exercise of the QCast is I'm getting to meet a whole bunch of people that I've always wanted to. Today, I have a couple really smart dudes with me and a couple guys that do a huge amount for the Division III basketball community. Welcome to Drew Pasteur and Matt Snyder. You might know them both by their Twitter handles, and we'll kind of talk about these handles. Matt is at FFTMAG, I believe. The origins of that are forever faithful to maroon and gold. We'll talk about that. And Drew is at D3 Bubble. And these guys do some amazing work for Division III. Guys, how are you doing? Drew, first with you. It's great to meet you, and you're looking good there. The College of Worcester in the spring looks beautiful.
Yes, it's a pretty campus. My family is fortunate to live right on the edge of campus, but I'm a native Southerner, so by January or February, I'm sort of ready for winter to be over, and I'm thinking ahead, not to the snowy days, but to what it looks like what's behind me.
It looks absolutely beautiful. It makes me want to take a trip there as we speak. And Matt Snyder, I believe I've called you an annoying Calvin person before. I think I've had some words for you. Welcome to the QCast, Matt Snyder.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be speaking actual words to you instead of tweets. That's been fun. You as well, Drew. And I deserve all of the annoying Calvin guy messages that you've given me, so I'll take it on.
Well, in all seriousness, I just first want to start with both of you guys to say thank you on behalf of Division III Basketball Nation for everything that you do. For those that don't know these guys, they do a lot with data and analytics, especially around the kind of the regional ranking picture, Pool C. They both do some efficiency stuff, which is incredible, but you definitely know them this time of year for the regional ranking and Pool C work they're doing. And just thank you, because I know you're doing that out of just for the love of the game kind of thing. It's not like you guys are monetizing this whole thing. So first of all, a thank you to this. Let me just start, guys, with, before we get into the regions and everything, and that's what everyone's looking forward to. They're also looking forward to hearing just a little bit about how you got to this point. Let me just ask both of you the same question. We'll start with Matt. So Matt, your Division III story, there's some story that's led all of us to what we do with Division III. Talk a little bit about how you got to this point and just a little around your D3 story.
Yeah, sure. I didn't grow up with Division III basketball in my picture, really, small college basketball at all. But when I was deciding what school to go to and I was kind of landing on Calvin, there was only a few things I knew about it. I knew they had won the national championship in 2000, and I was entering college in the fall of 2004. So that was fairly fresh. I knew about the Calvin Hope rivalry, and I knew that Calvin was sort of a Division III name brand program to whatever extent that exists. And since I grew up watching sports, I knew I was going to be involved in not participating. I can't put the ball in the net, but I can watch, right? I can cheer. So I knew I was going to attend the games and participate in that. So my freshman year on campus, going to a lot of the games, Calvin had a tremendous year, made a Final Four run, and that ended up really hooking me. Really started out with the conference tournament. They needed to win to get in. That was before the tournament expanded, I believe. So they won the conference tournament, which was at Albion. Albion had terrific teams that year. They were a top 10 team most of the year. Then they go to Wheaton. I'm on a student fan bus that Calvin sponsored to go to Wheaton. Calvin wins at a tip-in at the buzzer, go to Aurora next week. Anyway, ended up with packing a van full of some friends, going down to Salem, Virginia for the Final Four. Unfortunately, Rochester won that game in the last 2 minutes that Calvin kind of led most of the way. But that was just a great experience. And that experience hooked me into the love of Division III basketball, Calvin basketball, obviously. And that whole kind of tournament experience, just right off the bat, following them every game, traveling on the road, that kind of a little bit led into my tournament picture love as well. Just that experience informed all of that. So that being the first year right away, I haven't missed too many games since.
That's awesome stuff. Calvin has been one of the powers in the history of Division III. In fact, I think, guys, we're pretty well represented here today as far as name brands. We have Calvin, we have Worcester and Illinois Wesleyan. We're not doing too bad in terms of like all-time success. So that's cool. Drew, how about you? You know, very interested in your take of how you got to be a Division III fan. Talk us through your D3 story a little bit.
Sure. My route was a little bit later in life. I grew up in the heart of ACC country in the 1980s, watching Jim Valvano's teams and Kay Yao on the women's side against Krzyzewski and Dean Smith. And so dyed in the wool college basketball fan, ended up being the first one in my family to go to college at the University of Florida on an academic scholarship. Funny enough, ended up at the Final Four as a freshman as well. Cinderella run by one of Lon Kruger's teams in the mid-90s. A high school teacher and coach for a while, went back to grad school a few years later. And after doing my PhD at NC State in applied math, I landed at Worcester right out of grad school in a tenure track faculty role. And I mean, loved the academics, loved the sense of community, beautiful campus, small town. It's been great for my family and I. We live across the street from campus. And so we walk over to ball games and concerts. I now have a faculty athletic rep role, so involved in that way too. But we came to Worcester and it was a college basketball place and we loved that. Sort of one of the things that gets us through those cold Ohio winters. And Steve Moore had been there for goodness knows how long and won 800 and some games before he retired a couple of years ago. And then kind of on the numbers side, I started doing high school football rankings 20 plus years ago in North Carolina, brought that with me to Ohio, which is a high school football crazy state. Same kind of thing. There's a point system there. So predicting playoff teams, ranking teams, all the stuff that gets fans arguing all around the area. And a few years later, one year when Worcester was on the bubble, thought this would be kind of neat to look at some of this with small college basketball, and just kind of got hooked on that side.
Yeah, again, the three of us are from places where it's probably pretty easy to get hooked on Division III basketball, right? Good traditions, good environments, fun teams to follow, impressive student athletes. I appreciate you guys talking through that. I always find that to be pretty fascinating of how we all landed at this spot, this commonality of Division III. So thank you. What we want to do now is we want to transition here into kind of a deep dive of each region, or maybe not a deep dive, but at least a cursory glance at all 10 regions. Let's just first, before we kind of share some screen, I'm going to take a shot at this, and then I'm going to ask you guys what else you would add, or if you'd correct anything here. The selection criteria is pretty black and white. It's very black and white, and it's out there for anyone to find in the championship manual. So as part of this, I'll make sure to tweet that out. But there's some key numbers. First one is your winning percentage. The second one is your strength of schedule. The third one is your results versus regionally ranked opponents. So when you see WP and SOS and RRO, it's these three numbers that are foundational to the process. There's also some other criteria, such as your results against common opponents and some other things. But the numbers we're going to share are heavily related to those things. So Matt or Drew, Matt, I'll start with you. Is there anything you would add before we get into this for people to know?
Yeah, one thing is the difficulty in the black and white nature of the numbers for me anyway, is reconciling the winning percentage and the strength of schedule. There's no explicit formula that combines those two. We've heard some ratios in the past. Maybe they don't use those anymore. I sometimes use on my site an RPI number. The committee doesn't use that to combine those. So there's always the question of what does a high winning percentage versus middling SOS mean? And I think those are where the interesting conversations can come in.
It's a great point, because you have teams out there with a 90% plus winning percentage. strength of schedule is 480 or something like that. And conversely, you'll have a team with a 70% winning percentage, but a strength of schedule of, 0.600. How they reconcile that is pretty fascinating. Drew, anything on your end regarding how you explain the criteria as we start to dig into this?
Yeah, I agree with Matt that the interesting ones come at the outliers, at the team that played absolutely brutal schedule but took 8 or 9 losses, or even 10 and got into the tournament one year that I can recall, or the team that's 26-2, and well, have they really played anybody? That's where the challenges start to come. The other thing I think that may not be immediately clear to some that are newer to it is that it's not the regionally ranked opponent thing. It's not just the winning percentage or the number of wins, it's the overall results of, if you knocked out one of the top teams in the country, that can be looked at really differently than if you beat some team that's regionally ranked in a region that's not very deep, and they had to put some 6th or 7th team in there that probably wouldn't get ranked anywhere else. The quality of those teams you beat, even within that group, does make a difference.
Right. It's results versus regionally ranked opponents, not wins. So if someone has 3 wins and 3 losses against regionally ranked, to Drew's point, they look at each of the 3, they look at all 6 probably and look at those. The word results is very intentional. I think there's a belief that, playing a lot of those RRO games helps you. Certainly winning them helps you. So we're going to talk about that as we go through this. I'll also say that we needed to pick one of these guys' models to share screen and go through. I've chosen to pick Drew's. He's got a lot of cool stuff in there, but Matt's intimately knowledgeable on all this stuff too. So we're just going to tag team this thing as we go. So Drew, if you'll do the honors and share screen, let's start with region 1. We're going to go through all 10 regions. By the way, there's 10 regions now. There were 8 as recently as last year. And here we go. The brand new region 1. Drew, talk us through your key takeaways on region 1. I'll ask Matt to jump in. I'll let you know if I have any questions.
Sure. So in region 1, this is part of New England. This has the whole NESCAC that's typically a fairly deep league. And there's 3 teams that stand out here to me, Williams, Wesleyan, and St. Joe's.
Yeah.
You've got Williams and Wesleyan that are both in the NESCAC, plays a single round robin, so 10 conference games there. Known as a pretty tough league, and these teams are running up good records. St. Joe's is the last undefeated in small college basketball. And one of the things that you might note is after the 1,000 winning percentage is a 498 strength of schedule. That's a fairly marginal strength of schedule number. So we've got 3 teams that are really good. 2 of them have played a fairly soft non-conference schedule, but more than made up for it with their conference play. And then one of them went out and played anybody and everybody they could find that was good, the non-conference, but their league is weaker, and so that strength of schedule number is down a little bit. If we look at the right half too, it's likely to bounce back some. Some of this has to do with the order in which they've played some of those opponents in their conference. So those 3 stand out, and then we drop off a bit to get to Middlebury, and after that it drops off a lot.
So look, Matt Snyder, let me bring you in a second. And by the way, Drew, I love your projected resume because you can not only just see today, the current, but you can look forward to like, what might this look like? And it brings in the RROs. But Matt, what Drew is saying seems right to me, that this is a kind of a 3-team race for the number 1 spot in the region. Do you see that any differently? What are your thoughts, the top of region 1 here?
Yeah, I definitely agree on those 3 teams as being kind of in position to maybe claim a number 1 spot in the region. And then if you're looking at potential Pool C down the road, you're maybe only adding Middlebury back into that mix as well. I think the bottom of the rankings probably aren't going to have a huge hope for a Pool C bid when we're talking about the end of the year.
It's a great point. When you start to look for a cutoff point here, and Middlebury looks like, if I'm looking at the projected, Middlebury's resume looks really good moving forward. 750, 541, 3 and 4. If they land there, That seems pretty good. But look under that at the winning percentages. Trinity, Amherst, LaSalle, no chance, no chance, no chance with those in terms of Pool C. Is that what you're saying, Matt?
Yeah, definitely. The cutoff line term that you use is really good. I think you can kind of draw a line underneath Middlebury. Not saying Amherst or Trinity couldn't go on a run and change things, but I think they would really need to do that.
Drew, when we look at this region, really good resumes at the top here. If St. Joe were to go to New York and beat Yeshiva, I think your projection has them losing that game. It looks to me, right? That's the loss you have them with, is the Yeshiva
I believe
game?
that's correct.
So let's say they win that game, and now they're 7-0. And I mean, I would think that St. Joe would be the number one team in the region if they did beat Yeshiva. Would you agree with that?
I agree. I think that's likely to be the case. If they run the table undefeated and they've played several tough games, I think that SOS is going to be overlooked when there are a number of quality wins in there and they go undefeated. I think even right now, you could argue for putting them first, second, or third at this point. I think I might have even had them first last week, and it's just the SOS gap in the strength of schedule that's making that difference. But it seems there's a good argument for any of those as number one at the moment.
And when we get to Region 3, we'll talk about the implications of that game for Yeshiva. That's pretty fascinating. I think both of those teams are playing for a ton in that game. I would also say, and we'll tee this up, we'll probably come back to it. What does the number one ranking in the region mean? Well, when they seed the turn, or when they bracket the tournament, it's not like Division 1 where you have, all your seeds 1 through 16 and 4 brackets. It's not that way perfectly because of the geography limitations in Division 3. It's just not. But if you're number one in this region, you have a pretty good chance of being a team that can host all the way to the Final Four. So if St. Joe were to be the number one team, or Williams, or whoever it is, whoever that is going to have a really good chance of kind of having a bracket built around them and being able to host games, 4 games in a row, and then go to Fort Wayne. Agree with that, guys? Do you see that the team that would finish 1 here will have a chance to do that?
I think it's hard not to do that given the geography of D3, and there's a lot of teams in the Northeast that somebody out of Region 1 or 2 is likely to be hosting all the way until the Final Four.
And in the old eight region format, the math worked out that on average, the top 2 teams could host. It wasn't cut and dry like that. But now with 10 regions, you really don't feel good about it unless you're the number one team getting one of those hosting spots in the first round, and then before you even talk about the second weekend.
Great point. So keep an eye as we go through these. The team at the very top at the end is most likely in conversation to host. Now, not in every region. In some regions, the top team has a resume that does not stack up with some of the others across the country. But in this case, I promise you that the team that's number one here is going to have a great chance at it. Not a lock, but a great chance. Anything else on Region 1, guys, before we go to Region 2? Everyone good?
Yeah, we're good.
Let's roll, Drew, to Region 2. Okay, Region 2. Now you can see how we're still in the Northeast here. With these new regions, the way I look at it is you just kind of, Region 1 is up there in the Northeast, and you kind of keep coming south and slowly west as you go from 1 to 10 is how I think about it. But we're still full of Northeast schools at this point. The new MAC is in Region 2. The NESCAC is in Region 1. Drew, talk us through what you're seeing here with Region 2.
Sure. At this point, we've got a little clearer number one, I think, in this region than in some of the others, where WPI has got a very high winning percentage along with a solid strength of schedule here. Keene State, if the season ended today, would certainly be a tournament team. UMass Dartmouth got a big non-conference win recently over a NESCAC team. They certainly look like a tournament team at this point. And then we started to get to the question marks. Brandeis is really an interesting case and their schedule is as tough as anybody in the country, but they were 41 days between games recently, and they play in the UAA, which that's a tough league every night, even before you consider the travel of going all over the eastern half of the country. They've got the strength of schedule that if they can win a couple more games than expected, they're going to be in the tournament. It's just a matter of can they do that or not. And then you get down to teams like Nichols and Emerson. They're still in contention, even Babson potentially. They've got the schedules to have a chance and are just going to have to win some games. You notice that Emerson, Babson, and WPI are all in the NUMAC. I can flip over here and give a sense of what we might be looking at there of projected conference standings. Right now, I've got WPI maybe finishing about 13-1, only dropping one. And then a bit of a drop off. If you look at the far right column, though, Babson and Emerson both in contention for NCAA berths, maybe through Pool C. So there's a chance this region could be a little deeper than Region 1.
And we also, Matt, when we look at these things, we start to look at any common opponent results where we can start to stack up regions. I can't remember this off the top of my head. WPI, I believe, played a big game earlier. And I can't, did they play Wesleyan? Did they play Williams? Which game am I thinking of?
They lost to Wesleyan.
Okay, there we go. So they lost to Wesleyan. Now, Drew, can you flip back to Region 1 for a second? Because Wesleyan was one of the teams that we were talking about. Yeah, so let's just say that Wesleyan is the number one team here in Region 1, and WPI is the number one team in Region 2. Let's say the resumes are pretty close. You could have a situation where a hosting decision is settled by a head-to-head game there. So Matt, I mean, are you seeing where I'm going with that as you start to look at that? And that could be really significant result.
Right. Yeah. And when we talk about either hosting ability or Pool C board, which team's at the table, those kind of cross-regional games are golden for the committees to look at, compare and make those decisions, especially with close resumes.
Mass Dartmouth just won a really big game. They just beat Wesleyan on Saturday. So there's another example of a huge game where that common opponent could be an enormous thing. It's also big with RROs. Drew, you bring up a great case with Brandeis, and something I wanted to ask you guys with these new regions and the amount of teams that are ranked. Do you agree that we have to change our mindset on what a regionally ranked resume looks like? Because if there's if there's all these teams ranked now, there's 10 regions, and I can't remember the total amount of teams ranked across the 10, but it's more. It's a lot more than before. Your resume at the bottom of these regions is going to be weaker than what we're used to. Am I saying that? You guys know I'm not a math major, so check me on this, but do you agree with that?
Yeah, more teams ranked overall. I think it's 20% is the new benchmark. So you've got somewhere on the order of 83 teams ranked across the country. That's a lot. In some regions, they're deep enough where they all make sense. And sometimes we're going to be grasping at straws a little bit for who gets into the bottom of the region. And yet that might mean 2 more regionally ranked wins for somebody that could turn out to be significant.
Absolutely. And anything else on Region 2, guys, before we roll to Region 3?
Yeah, it's just notable. It has fewer ranked teams in Region 2 than Region 1. So there's fewer teams overall. So the different percentage, or the same percentage, but it's fewer teams. But where we kind of drew the line underneath the 4th team in Region 1, I wouldn't really feel comfortable drawing a line in this region anywhere in the top 6 teams. I think all these teams could make a Pool C push. And as Drew mentioned, there's 3 NUMAC teams. Even Babson could maybe make a push at it, not with the projected resume on the screen there, but if there's not too much carnage within that conference, you could see an off the board team come to the table for the Pool C discussion down the road.
Right. Certainly Emerson with that, let's say the 708, 568, 3 and 4. I mean, thinking of past resumes, that would seem to be in in a bubble situation there. So great point, Drew. All the way down to Emerson. This region is so far in pretty good shape.
It's a pretty interesting region to look at. I think even down to Babson, there's 7 teams that are still in play for those potential Pool C at large berths. But it's going to be who can play their way in or out, as we see the 3 new MAC teams, the 2 in the Little East and Keene State and Mass Dartmouth. They both look pretty good for right now. That's not necessarily a 2-bid league traditionally, but it certainly looks like it could be this year.
Yeah, and you got just everything this year. Every year is fresh, right? That we'll get to Region 8. The CCIW might get 1 team in. That's very possible. So you got to, every year's a blank slate. The resume for that year's what matters, and that's a great point. Let's roll to Region 3. And knowing my friends at Yeshiva, this will be the most watched segment of the program. Yeah. I mean, look, Max Nation guys, they're big time, and they're gonna really focus on this. So let's not screw up Region 3. Drew, talk us through the Region 3 picture here.
Yeah, this is a really interesting region to me. And when we get the first ordered regional rankings, just a couple of weeks before the tournament, I'm going to be really interested to see what the committee does with it. At the top of the region, as you look at those first 4, look at the strength of schedule numbers for right now. RPI is at 542, which is pretty solid, typical kind of tournament team. And then the next 3 are all under 500. They're in the 480s. If you get to the end of the year and your SOS is under 500, historically, that's been a bit of a death knell for getting an at-large bid. But all 3 of these teams have outstanding records. And in particular, if you look at Nazareth, they're projected to end up with 5 regionally ranked wins. That might be one that gets you in. But at this point, Oswego, Nazareth, Yeshiva are all teams that have run up terrific records without having the big wins in terms of strength of schedule to get them there. So those 3 you could put in any order. And then RPI is not quite at the same level and having 2 losses instead of 1, but they've played a tougher schedule. And even if you keep going a little farther down to Rochester, again, we talk about that University Athletic Association where there are 6, maybe even 7 quality teams this year. They're just beating each other up. But if Rochester can go on a winning streak, they get that winning percentage up to about 700, they'd be a lock.
It's a great point, Matt. As you look at this region, pretty fascinating from many standpoints of the criteria. What stands out to you, Matt, as you look at Region 3?
Yeah, just echoing the middling strength of schedule numbers there, or maybe not middling when if it's below 500, it's low, it's bad. And we've had conversations about Yeshiva on Twitter. Seems like all season. Maybe we haven't always contextualized that within this region. They're not an outlier on the strength of schedule there, so they might have an opportunity to float up a little bit comparatively to Nazareth and Oswego. They look very similar.
Now, if you look at the projected resume, there is a little gap there, right? As Yeshiva he's got it 491, and no one else is in the 4s there above them. And so as we look forward, Yeshiva looks like for sure is finishing under 500 there in the SOS, right?
Yeah. And they're going to need the regionally ranked opponents to carry them. Unfortunately, it's not looking like they're going to stand out in that regard with only a couple of really strong games. Against quality top level opponents. So that's gonna hurt them. One other thing about the region, we kind of talked about this beforehand about how head to head and common opponents can play into it. Oswego State did play Nazareth, and Nazareth won that game. So that will definitely play into the rankings once the committee looks at those. Is hey, if these teams have gone head to head and they're close, the preference is going to go to the victor right there.
So Drew, on Yeshiva, because it is the fascinating story, you have them 1 and 2 regionally ranked record results. Is the one St. Joe? Is that what is it St. Joe is the win?
Maybe. This is taken out of the way that I get this is running thousands of simulations of the rest of the season and all of the regional rankings with some uncertainty over how the committees might weigh things out. And it says on average, that's that 1 and 2 they end up with. I don't know if that's St. Joe there, and perhaps to get the third one.
Yeah, NJCU, and I'm trying to figure out if the RROs for Yeshiva, they played NJCU and they played Lycoming and Eastern Connecticut, and I can't remember if any of those teams are in the picture or not. So I'm just trying to figure out where that 1 and 2 comes from. It's okay if I hear you, it's a simulation. It's something to keep an eye on though, right? Because that 1 jumps off the page as a crazy low number. If they only had 1 RRO, think of what we saw in region 1 and 2, and think of what's above Yeshiva in region 3. To have just 1 RRO, do you guys agree? Like that jumps off the page and is going to hurt.
There's only one other team in the country with a similar resume. We'll get to that in a few minutes, of somebody else that's won a lot of games and actually has a decent SOS, but is not going to have more than 1 or 2 regionally ranked wins.
Flip back, if you would, Drew, just before we leave region 3, just go back to that big picture here. So that, if we look to the projected resume, that I think this is where the conversation all year has gone about Yeshiva. There's 2 problems in their resume that would hurt tremendously if they're in the Pool C picture. And if they win the Skyline, they're in. Then they just have to worry about kind of where they're seated, and no big deal. But if they're in a Pool C picture, they have a SOS that's under 500 and 1 regionally ranked win potentially. Can you flip to like region 1 again for a second, Drew? I just want to compare visually. I mean, look at 6, 6, 6, 3. That's kind of what you're up against when you're in the Pool C discussion. I believe, let's leave it here, and I'll ask you guys this as our closing thought in region 3. If Yeshiva were to lose somehow in the Skyline Conference tournament, do we all agree that they're on the bubble? They're on the bubble big time. Agree with that? Let's start with Matt.
Yeah, they would not be feeling comfortable at all. I think if they don't win the Skyline, you really got to have that St. Joe's win to even have a prayer. But I think if they don't win the Skyline, they're stuck on the board.
So I think you and I are on the same page. We'll see if Drew agrees. They need to beat St. Joe to even have a fighting chance if they lose in the Skyline. Agree with that?
I think it's going to be tough. I'm interested to see what the committee shows us when they start ranking these teams a couple of weeks ahead, and what respect is their resume getting at that point. Perhaps even, I can't recall when the St. Joe game is, but it sure seems like when you only have 2 teams that are top 100 type teams on your schedule, if you go 0 and 2, it's going to be really tough. It's not the first time we've seen something like this. I recall a few years ago, Lancaster Bible was undefeated entering the tournament, and they weren't even regionally ranked. We were told if they had dropped a game in their conference tournament, they would have been out at 27-1 or something similar. Yep. I don't think Yeshiva is quite in that position, but it would take a lot of conversation to get them in. I won't say they're dead in the water if they lose both of those games and then fall in the Skyline tournament, but it would be tough to see them getting in over some of the other resumes.
And then it comes down to where are they regionally ranked, because in the Pool C process, there's a pecking order here that goes in order of the region. So let's just say that Nazareth ends up as a Pool C candidate and they're ranked ahead of Yeshiva. Well, Nazareth has to get picked first in the Pool C process. They have to come off the board for Yeshiva to come on the board to even be discussed. So that's why the regional ranking order matters so much. Great job on that, guys. I think we painted a pretty clear picture of just the fact that Yeshiva is in a pretty tough spot. If they do lose in the Skyline, beating St. Joe would help. Let's go to region 4. Let's take a look at the picture there. Walk us through what you're seeing in region 4 here, Drew.
So we've got DeSales out of the MAC Freedom Conference up at the top of this region. SOS again is a little bit borderline, but at 16-1, and we see eventually they're going to have some wins over regionally ranked opponents, perhaps including one from their own conference. They sit up on the top. Rowan is still in. Rowan and Stockton, I believe, play in the next couple of days. That's going to be a pretty significant game for Pool C. Neither has a terrific SOS. They're going to need a decent winning percentage to get there. I think those are bubble teams. And after that, it gets tough really fast. Penn State Harrisburg is in one of the weakest leagues in the country. They're going to be well below 500, and 26-2 is just not going to be good enough there. I think we're really looking at these top three, and after that, it's just about regionally ranked opponents for other teams. So where these come up, this might be the weakest region of all 10.
And to close the circle on the Yeshiva conversation, there's Lycoming. That's one of the teams Yeshiva beat. I think it was opening weekend. So Lycoming getting regionally ranked here in Region 4 is really big for Yeshiva in Region 3. They desperately need all the RRO numbers they can get. Matt, as you look at Region 4 here, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, if I'm not DeSales, if I'm anyone else, I'm not feeling great about the Pool C picture. You might get one or two of those in. You might not get one or two of those in. I think DeSales should feel pretty good with where they're at with their winning percentage. But again, it's the strength of schedules down the region. They don't really stand out. Most of them are on the positive side of 500, but when you get to the Pool C selection, I think my impression is the committee likes to find a piece of criteria that is on the plus side of things that really stands out. And you don't really get that unless you're 550 on the strength of schedule, or significantly in the 800s on winning percentage, or multiple regionally ranked wins. And there's not a lot of those resumes in this region.
PSU Harrisburg's another good discussion of Pool C. Let's say that they were a Pool C candidate. That 467 is a killer. I think that it's a similar conversation to Yeshiva, although didn't Yeshiva have a higher SOS than that, like closer to 0.500?
490s.
Yeah. So there we go. Yeshiva was 491. So I would say you compare the two, Yeshiva probably comes out ahead there, but both you'd have to say would be bubble at best if they end up in the Pool C conversation. Drew, any final thoughts on Region 4 before we move on?
I don't have anything else on this one.
Okay, let's roll to Region 5. Okay, talk us through it, Drew.
So Region 5, we've got the two big teams in the Centennial, Hopkins and Swarthmore at the top. There is a head-to-head that I don't include my model that would come into play here. Swarthmore just beat Johns Hopkins a few weeks ago. They've still got likely 2 more games yet to come. But I would flip the order of these two if I was the committee right now based on the head-to-head. But those two stand out pretty well at the top of the league. One thing I'll point to, Hopkins is the other interesting case in that they just don't, let's assume that they get beat by Swarthmore. They don't end up with a win there. 1-3 against regionally ranked opponents is not a number that we normally see with that 552. I'll pull their details in just a minute, but so those two kind of sit it up at the top. Eastern at the moment, 813 winning percentage, 550 SOS. That looks like that's in play for a Pool C bid. And then after that, it drops off really fast. Again, we're just not so deep in this region. Maybe a Hood College or Susquehanna or somebody could make a big run and end up in the 8s and put themselves into play. But for right now, it looks like 3 is about where our cutoff line might be.
And Matt, when you look at the top of this, do you agree? Because I do agree with Drew that you would flip Swarthmore to be the number 1 in this region based on the head-to-head at this very moment. Are you in the same place on that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree.
And then we look at the Pool C resume of Hopkins. To Drew's point, if we look at the projected, one RRO win becomes a big time problem. I'm not saying that they would be out, because 840, 552 is going to look really good. But that one is something that's going to jump out in a way that's not so good for JHU.
Yeah. And then if your team's below them, that becomes the problem for you, as you mentioned earlier, stuck on the table. that might mean it takes Hopkins, should they not win the Pool A, a few more rounds of selections to get in. And that might be Eastern, that might be Hood, that's not getting to the table soon enough. So that could disadvantage them as well.
In that Pool C process, the general way it works is, you picture all 10 regions putting their top Pool C candidate on the board, so to speak, or at the table, whatever your wording is.
Yep.
And let's say that the top team from region 7 gets picked, and then you put another 7 in there, and then you start the process over.
Mm-hmm.
You could have a situation where the top Pool C from a certain weak region, a region with weak resumes, sits on the board for 20 rounds of Pool C without getting picked. I think that's rare that would happen, but it could happen. And I think it has actually.
Mm-hmm.
So that's Matt's point about kind of getting stuck. Drew, what are you seeing with Hopkins' resume here?
Yeah, the interesting things are, I will tell you, it's hard for me to see Hopkins not making the tournament, even if they will all 3 chances against Swarthmore, the 2 regular season and presumably in the Centennial Conference final. I'm not convinced that's enough to knock them out when you look at that 840 winning percentage, 550-ish SOS is pretty strong. And one of the secondary criteria, the non-conference SOS of almost 600, says they went out and did everything they could to play good teams, and they just ended up not being regionally ranked. I think that is a number that might get looked at in this situation where they have a lot of teams that are just out of the rankings there. It's hard for me to see Hopkins, if that's the only games they lose, or to Swarthmore, I still think they get in comfortably, but it's one of the more unusual resumes in this year's group.
And I agree with you. It seems to me like that resume would get Hopkins in. If you could go back to the region 5 kind of front page there, 840, 552 with a 1, I believes in. Do you guys agree, going back to like PSU, Harrisburg, and Yeshiva, do you agree that Hopkins would clearly get in as a Pool C over Yeshiva and PSU, Harrisburg with the numbers we looked at over there? Do you guys see the same thing I'm seeing?
Yeah, almost without a doubt, they're a much stronger candidate.
Drew, how about you? Do you agree with that?
Agree. That SOS gulf between 550 and something sub 500 is enormous.
Anything else on this region we need to touch on, guys?
No, just great point about the non-conference strength of schedules as a secondary criteria item. It's something we're going over this fast, we're not talking about, but when the decisions are close, the committee will pull in those numbers and help them make the decisions there.
Great point. Great point. Let's go to Region 6. And this is where we start to bring in some teams that used to be in the South region. So talk through Region 6, which is led by Randolph-Macon.
Well, Randolph-Macon, polls #1 team, consensus #1 team in the country right now. They've got everything you could want in a resume. I mean, they've won every game but one. That SOS number is astronomical at over 600. If we look ahead, projected to have 8 wins over regionally ranked opponents and a non-conference SOS well into the 6s too. This is an ironclad resume at this stage and the kind of thing that gets a team to stay at home all the way until going to Fort Wayne. Christopher Newport looking awfully strong, 900-ish winning percentage. Again, very high SOS. They look very solid. Emory, the issue is going to be the winning percentage potentially. They have also got a really, really tough schedule up into the 6s, several wins against regionally ranked opponents. If you fall below 700, it starts to get iffy. If you fall into those mid 6s, then it's going to take a really unusual case to get in. So in the UAA, like we've talked about in other regions, it's just a matter of how many games are they going to win? Can they get the winning percentage there? Beyond that, we go down to second ODAC team. I think the ODAC is likely to have a second strong resume emerge, but I sure don't know who it's going to be yet. Among Maryville, Lynchburg, and others, it could be they cannibalize each other enough that if Randolph-Macon wins the tournament, that's it. But I think they probably end up with a second team in. Maryville is an interesting case.
They are.
Along the lines of Yeshiva and others.
Yeah. Look at
one of the
that.
weaker leagues in the country, and they've put together a really good record. This is a nationally ranked team, though the polls don't matter for NCAA selections. But the winning percentage may drop sub 500, and they don't have a lot of key victories to hang their hat on.
That Maryville resume, Matt, is pretty interesting because this is a highly ranked team in the top 25 poll, which Drew points out means zero. This is what means stuff, is these numbers. But boy, if Maryville, Matt, is 870, 495, and just 1-1, that sounds like a long selection Sunday into Monday morning. Do you agree with that? Maryville is not in a great spot there?
Yeah, those numbers sound a little bit worse than Yeshiva to me. The one thing that I'm showing right now that will help them is a 544 non-conference strength of schedule as of today. So I think if it's close, they're on the bubble and they played a pretty good non-conference schedule, then that might put them on the right side of the bubble. But I'm very interested in seeing what the committee does to Maryville for those reasons. And I know they don't like me because of my efficiency ratings don't have them as high as the top 25, but they're putting together a very good season, and I'm very interested to see how they end up in the regional rankings.
Well, another big thing too is, they played Emory. I think they led that game 18-2 and they lost it. If they would have beaten Emory, it would change their fortunes tremendously in the regional rankings, and they lost that game. And I hadn't looked at Maryville's regional ranking resume until this moment, and I'm just kind of picking up on the fact that they're going to want to win that conference tournament. What do you see here, Drew, on the deep dive with Maryville?
So here's their schedule. We see they, again, lost that game at Emory by single digits early in the season. Hampton-Sydney is a decent win that's there. They've beaten Oglethorpe on the road. But once they get into conference play, the USA South is not a strong league. And when there's divisional play on top of that, there aren't many teams that are much over 500 there. And so it just really pulls things down. I think they probably need that automatic bid from the USA South to get in, given the sub 500 SOS, especially if they have, say, 3 losses rather than maybe 2, like a Yeshiva might end up with.
They might have something that could help at the end of the season. Emory lost at Covenant, and Maryville has a chance to beat Covenant twice. And you could bring in common opponent there and you say Maryville lost to Emory head to head. It was at Emory, okay. But then Maryville beats Covenant twice. Emory lost. If the numbers are close, that could come into play. I'm just using some examples of how this stuff plays out. Can you go back to the main page of this region for us, Drew, before we move on? Matt, do you agree that if you're writing down teams that are going to have a bracket built around them, I'm talking like, quote, top 4 seeds, Randolph-Macon is the safest bet that we've seen in a long time for that to happen. Do you agree with that?
Oh, definitely. I'm trying to see if I have a number, a seeding for them really quick, but they're definitely one of the strongest in the country. Yeah, they would be my number 1 overall seed, I think, as of right now, just based on some of the criteria. So that means potentially hosting all the way to Fort Wayne should they keep on winning.
And we'll try to remember we've talked about 2 teams now potentially this way. Randolph-Macon, lock it in unless they implode. They are one of these top 4 seeds. Potentially, we talked about the Region 1 top. We talked about St. Joe, Wesley, and Williams. There's a good chance there, not a lock, but if you're locking these things in, and when we get to Region 7, I'm going to propose lock number 2. Anything else on Region 6 here, Drew, before we move on?
As we talk about geography for the tournament, it is notable that there's that 600-mile radius without having to fly. And the way that D3 is built, not as much as in the next region, almost most of D3 can get to Ohio in 600 miles, but there's an awful lot of places that can get to Virginia within 600 miles as well. And so it provides some flexibility when those top seeds turn that way.
It's I've heard it called the game changer by someone that's on the committee. The ability to make the bracket now where you've got the 600 miles to play with, both north and south, when you're talking about what that does for East Coast teams, North and South, and when you're talking about East and West into Ohio, et cetera. Great point, Drew, on the 600 miles. Let's go into Region 7. I believe that Region 7 now, when you look at historical perspective, if the Central region last year and the decade before, if that was the best region, I believe this now becomes kind of the deepest, strongest region from like a historical power standpoint. So this is a good one. Talk us through, Drew, what you're seeing in this region.
Sure. So at the top, we have the trio of teams from the Ohio Athletic Conference. Marietta recently beat the two behind them, Mount Union and Heidelberg, back to back. Marietta's running away with this region, and that 620 strength of schedule pops out at you, along with only having dropped a couple of games, potentially 8 regionally ranked opponents beaten. This looks like another one of those teams you're talking about that's likely to find itself at home. And as with Randolph-Macon, that's not an easy place to go into, let alone in March. I have been there as a visiting fan in March before, and it's quite an environment to see a game in. Mount Union and Heidelberg are right behind them. Heidelberg has a game with Baldwin Wallace, who's a little farther down in the region, I believe tomorrow or Thursday. And then Case Western has their best team in a long, long time. And in that tough University Athletic Association, though, the losses can add up in a hurry. I think Cases right now, I would have them in, but they're a little bit more of a bubble team projected at this point. And below that, the other teams are going to need a pretty good run through the rest of the regular season, or else find themselves needing those Pool A automatic bids from their conferences.
And as Matt Snyder knows, I need his Calvin Knights to hang on to this regional ranking. Matt Snyder, your team's been killing me. We have a win over you guys. I'm just grinding out that RRO, and I'm not sold on what you guys are doing. You lost the game down at Trinity. You lost some crazy game in the MIAA the other week. Tell me that Calvin's going to hold on here, buddy.
I mean, Calvin's going to need the Pool A. If they get the Pool A, then that's a better chance they end up in the regional rankings, because those are more wins without any losses.
Help me out.
I don't know. I can't guarantee it to you. I'm trying to do it for you, Bob. I'm trying to.
Can the Morrison kid play better? Let's get some things going there.
We're gonna catch fire. We just beat Shrine last second defensive stand. I think they're gonna pull it out. I'd love to see them in the regional rankings.
In all seriousness, on this region, Matt, do you agree that Marietta, unless there's an implosion, write them down that this is a place that's going to be a number 1 seed and probably hosting for 2 weekends? What do you think about that?
Yeah, we're going to have games at the Banjo in March. And I think you can lock that in. My loose math calls them the number 3 overall seed in the tournament. So I think Ohio also kind of being a geographical middle point of some of the regions. I think we're going to get an interesting region in Marietta. As far as the rest of the region goes, the bubble is going to be really interesting here, because outside of those top 3, I don't think you have any slam dunks. Hope maybe is, maybe isn't a Pool C team. Case maybe is, maybe isn't. Wabash maybe is, maybe isn't.
Let me ask you this, Matt Snyder. Let me put you on the record here. Hope versus Yeshiva, Pool C table. Who you taking? Resume based on projected resume there. Who do you got? Hope versus Yeshiva.
Yeah, it's going to really, the Yeshiva St. Joseph game. It's very important when you don't play a lot of good teams. That one game can make all the difference in the world. If they end up with 0 regionally ranked wins, then maybe you turn to Hope's resume. If they have a win in there, or one of those teams like Lycoming ends up in the regional rankings, then maybe you can end up with Yeshiva. I'm going to be very non-committal, because I don't want my direct messages to fill up from Yeshiva Twitter again.
But this is a good example, though. And Drew, check me on this, but this is a great example. So Marietta and Mount Union, someone's got to be the Pool C right at the top of the region. So let's say Mount Union hits the board first in Region 7. They get picked early. Heidelberg, they look very safe to me. They get picked. Now Case Western's on the board with several rounds to go. right now, that resume for Case looks good, but to your point, that's a tough conference when so who knows if that is their final resume. But now you get Hope sitting on that board for a while. And this is an example where this region is going to start just going through these pool Cs that are going to get picked. And now Hope's on the board. And Yeshiva's been sitting there. This is just our favorite example. Yeshiva's been sitting there for round after round. And now you run into Hope. I'm not sure Yeshiva wins the Hope. They might, but it's a fascinating thing to look at, right? Like as we look through this.
So one more thing, Hope's non-conference strength of the schedule that I'm showing right now, 619. That's going to compare very favorably. And this region has a lot of really strong non-conference strength of schedule. So if we get into secondary criteria, that's going to favor this region.
At the top of the region, Drew, Mount Union now has earned the split with Heidelberg. So for a while, Heidelberg had this win at Mount Union by like 20 points. And now the reverse just happened. So now Mount Union has neutralized that record. So I agree that they now are good being ranked ahead of Heidelberg. Is that what you're thinking?
I think at this point, the difference in the records, one loss is still a lot. When you've only played 15 games, that's roughly 70 points of winning percentage. And when the schedule differences are not huge, then for right now, that's going to put us there. But still a lot of basketball to be played. I could see either of those coming in second in the region, or if Case Western continues to impress, they potentially could pass them both.
Yeah, Case is another great team to keep an eye on. They just won a really big game over Rochester over the weekend. Rochester's a team that Drew's got ranked over there in, what is that, Region 3, I believe it is. So that was a big one. If Case could find a way there at home in Cleveland to beat Wash U, that would cement their status, I believe. Do you guys agree with that? That a win over Wash U by Case would be gold.
That would go along.
Agree. Matt, do you see that the same way?
Yeah, they're going to need to, I think, find one of those wins in UAA play to feel very comfortable about where they're going to sit in at large. Well, that's an at large conference, right? If they don't win it, so no tournament.
Yeah, you're right. They're going to need to win one of those type of games for sure. They're not a lock. Case is a team that's got to tell themselves, we need to win. I think that Wash U game, I don't think it's a must win, but if they want to feel pretty good about things, they need to win that game. Anything else on the Powerhouse Region 7 here, gentlemen? The
other thing I would put is the North Coast Athletic Conference looks like a one-bid league this year, potentially. Wabash is the only Pool C candidate left. It's been 20 years since Worcester missed the tournament, but Worcester's going to need to win the NCAC tournament this year. It's funny how these things go from one year to the next. This was a 2 or 3 bid league at times, but looks like just one this year.
Great point. Wabash sitting there, you got them buried behind Hope at this point. If Wabash needed a Pool C, I don't know. I don't feel too good about that considering the amount of Region 7 teams that have to get picked first. So if you're Wabash, if you're the Little Giants, you're probably thinking we need to get that NCAC automatic bid. And to Drew's point, a lot of teams, every other team's thinking the same thing, like Worcester, etc. Let's go to Region 8, guys. My home region, so to speak. I've been dreading this moment for weeks. I keep clicking on your stuff, guys, and I'm like, oh, the Illinois Wesleyan is still ahead of Wash U. And then like the last 2 days, it finally happened. I clicked on Matt's thing first, and then I cursed him. And then I clicked on Drew's thing a second later, and I cursed him. But I guess the inevitable has happened for my Titans is that Wash U's resume now and the SOS gap has closed so much. And now the head-to-head, really at this point, it's a lock as we speak that Wash U is ahead of Illinois Wesleyan in Region 8. Is that how you're seeing that, Drew?
For the moment, I think it is. Eventually, that non-conference SOS could be a point that brings it back together. If they're close, we look at the projected 80-point gap in non-conference SOS. If they end up about the same, we've still got that head-to-head win. that might end up being the decider. I think it's going to be awfully tough to chase down WashU unless they lose multiple UAA games.
Yeah, I think at the top here, you've got a lot of like the WashU game at Case Western is really big. Tomorrow night, Illinois Wesleyan has a game at Elmhurst that's sort of a coin flip game. If Illinois Wesleyan were to win that, it would help. But, Matt, we're talking about the top here. The reason we're talking about the top two is because when we talk about that, who's going to be a number one seed, I think whoever is higher, Illinois Wesleyan or WashU, is in the conversation, not a lock.
Yeah.
But do you agree, Matt, that WashU's ahead of Illinois Wesleyan, and whoever ends up number one has a fighting chance at one of those build a bracket around moments?
Yeah, they very well could be. The challenge is that the Wisconsin Conference looms geographically, right?
Yeah.
But if you want to be talking about second weekend hosting, you're probably going to want to finish on top of this region. I would love to see both of these teams host in the first weekend if the geography works out.
Probably pretty safe if things play out the rest of the way like they could or should. Probably both host the first weekend.
Yeah.
The second weekend, to your point, now we'll get to Region 9. You got Oshkosh and Platteville. Illinois Wesleyan beat Oshkosh. Oshkosh beat Platteville. You got some interesting dynamics going on. Drew, talk us through, let's go lower than number 2 here. Talk us through the rest of Region 8.
Sure. Once we get past those first two, things get pretty dicey pretty quick. If you look at Wheaton, 730 winning percentage, even with a good SOS and several regionally ranked wins, that gets a little tough. The last time that the CCIW got only one bid was 2007. It's been 15 years. But when you look at these teams, it's tough to see that anybody's got a real hold on that second bid at the moment. Certainly if somebody else wins the conference tournament, other than Illinois Wesleyan, you get 2 bids. But suppose the Titans take the tournament, I don't know. Somebody's got to make a run here out of North Central, Wheaton, or Elmhurst in order to put themselves into the Pool C kind of position.
Let's go back to that the Region 8 page. It is fascinating because Wheaton lost at Milliken and they lost at home to Augustana. Those are 2 games on paper that have really hurt them at this point. 731, 546, 4-4. This is probably, we won't go through the exercise again, but stack that up versus Wheaton and Yeshiva sitting on the table in round 20. Yeshiva lost to Illinois Wesleyan. Wheaton beat Illinois Wesleyan. 546 versus 490 something, 4-4 versus 1-2. Just making the case again here that these numbers are fascinating when you start comparing different looking resumes. Matt, Wheaton, Elmhurst, the CCIW is used to getting, 3 teams in the tournament, 2 Pool Cs. Do you agree with Drew that the CCIW is in a lot of trouble here?
Yeah, if they continue to beat themselves up, it could be a lot of trouble. I would, in that Yeshiva, we always have to compare everyone to Yeshiva. I would take Wheaton with this projected resume. But if you had asked me a month ago if the CCIW is potentially a one big league, I would have said that you were crazy. But there is a world in which that happens. I bet we get 2, but
I'm betting on 2.
Someone's got to rise up here and be that number 2 team.
Well, the team that it's going to need to be Wheaton, because if you look at where Wheaton is versus Elmhurst now, I think Wheaton's the more logical chance here. I mean, do you agree, Drew, that if someone's going to be a Pool C team behind Illinois Wesleyan, it's probably just Wheaton, right?
I think Wheaton's got the best chance. Even Elmhurst potentially, given the high SOS, if they start winning games and start to make a run the rest of the way, maybe say they win out in the regular season. I realize they've still got to play everybody else second time, but they could play themselves into Pool C position even. But Wheaton seems to be the more logical one that has the best chance of getting there at this point. I agree with both of you. I've still got, if we look at average number of bids per conference, at the CCIW is still just under 2. I think it's much more likely they get 2 than 1, but there's no guarantee. this year of that second bid.
And Wheaton's schedule is pretty good the rest of the way. So Wheaton's still got to go to Illinois Wesleyan, but Wheaton's done with Elmhurst, which helps. So they've got tough games. I think Wheaton still has to play at North Central, at Illinois Wesleyan. Being done with Elmhurst is good. So look, we'll see. But yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road on some of these criteria. Hanover, 840, 514, 4-1. Here's another one of those common opponent things that comes into play. Wheaton and Hanover are sitting there in a Region 8 discussion. I watched both of these games. Wheaton won at Olivet and Hanover lost at Olivet. That random game that happened on a very quiet December afternoon, whenever that was, those games, that common opponent situation could be a big factor in Wheaton versus Hanover. Am I making too much of that, Matt Snyder, or are you with me that, hey, you never know?
I mean, when it gets close, you definitely look at those, and those are primary criteria that it's not as visible to us. So yeah, the committee is going to definitely look at that. And as I pull up their resumes, that's the only common opponent that they have. So if it's Hanover versus Wheaton and they're close, Hanover jumps.
Anything else, Drew, on Region 8 before we move to 9?
As we look at Hanover, this is another one of those situations like what you were talking about of hoping that Calvin ends up ranked. Look at the bottom of this region. There's Rose-Hulman and Anderson kind of hanging on with no realistic shot at a Pool C bid, but who gets ranked 8th or 9th could make a big difference in that regionally ranked opponent number for Hanover. I see 4-1. I think, wow, when they played good teams, they beat them. If that ends up being 2-1, I'm pretty unimpressed. And that becomes a little harder to make that selection.
That's a great point. So you're saying that Hanover's 4-1 includes wins over Rose-Hulman and Anderson in the conference. And if Rose-Hulman and Anderson disappear from the top 9, that goes away. That's a phenomenal point. That's how people need to be looking at this stuff. Let's go to Region 9. Let's talk about the WIAC and the rest of the picture. So Drew, talk us through Region 9.
The WIAC is maybe historically the most powerful conference in all of D3, but these top 3 are just something else this year. I mean, these are 3 ironclad resumes. If I pull up the conference sheet here, NCAA berth, 99, 99, 99. It's going to take either the whole team getting thrown out of school or COVID or something to knock any of these out of the tournament at this point. 3 real powerhouse teams at the top of the region, and it's just a matter of who ends up number 1. You look at those 600-ish SOS numbers, you win 80% of your games, and that's plenty. So those 3, it's going to be kind of hard to break into at the top of the region. Wartburg's an interesting case in that they've got a pretty solid number to not be in one of these elite leagues. 570 SOS, they're projecting to be 550, several wins over regionally ranked opponents. That looks like a team that gets into me. And then you've got the 2 teams from the Minnesota Conference at the top. Those numbers aren't quite as strong, but I think we're probably getting into bubble kind of territory here. Maybe Augsburg and St. John's both get in. There's a little bit of a drop to Carleton at that point. Maybe only one of them gets in, barring something interesting in the conference tournaments, but that's about where I see us getting into bubble territory.
With the top of this league here, I guess I would say that at this point, if we had to do a real ranking, we'd put Oshkosh number 1. They won at Platteville. And well, let me ask you that. So I don't want to put words in your mouth. Let me ask Matt Snyder. Matt, would you have Oshkosh 1 because of the head-to-head at this point, that the head-to-head that was at Platteville, or would you still have Platteville number 1?
I would put Oshkosh number 1. They're both very strong, and they're both teams. If you could, you would build a bracket around.
First, Drew, what do you think? We talked earlier about a head-to-head. I think it was Swarthmore and Hopkins. Would you have Oshkosh number 1 here?
I would. Even with the second loss, they have the strongest SOS of the 3. They've got the wins overall over regionally ranked opponents. Looking at a little bit, I think Oshkosh gets this, despite what my model says, without the head-to-head.
Something to remember about the other teams here is check me on this, but I believe Oshkosh has already won at Platteville, which means the return game is at Oshkosh. I think Oshkosh has won at La Crosse, which means La Crosse has to go there. Let's make sure I'm saying that right yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the locations. I know the Oshkosh's blemish is the Whitewater loss. And I don't think Platteville's lost in conference yet, have they?
Yeah, I think Oshkosh, outside of the Whitewater loss, that's their only league loss, I believe. So let's see here. Where was the La Crosse game? They won at La Crosse and they won at Platteville. So when you talk about like the paths the rest of the way, the Platteville game's at home, the La Crosse game's at home, and that's a big deal. They still got to go to Whitewater. But I think if you're trying to make a favorite for this region, I think Oshkosh is your favorite to be the top seeded team. Now, let me ask you guys this as we start to compare, because we've said that top seeds could be Randolph-Macon and Marietta, done deal. Maybe the Northeast top team. Let's call it St. Joe for now. St. Joe, Randolph-Macon, Marietta. You got one more. How do you stack up Oshkosh versus WashU and Illinois Wesleyan at this point? I'm just curious how you guys, how that decision would get made, because it's pretty fascinating. Illinois Wesleyan beat Oshkosh.
Yeah.
WashU beat Illinois Wesleyan. Who wins that battle? Any thoughts on that?
I think I'm going to go with Oshkosh at this point. The head-to-heads are a little bit tough to figure out there. Ultra high SOS. One of the other things I'd look at is eventually at this line, if we're talking about 8 wins over regionally ranked opponents, and this is not the Region 4 kind of
right,
whoever happened to slip into the rankings. This is a deep region. These are good teams. Occasionally, we've heard references in to the top 50 or top 100, even though it's not in the selection criteria. You beat 14 teams in the top 100. That's just a brutal schedule with a impressive record. I think Oshkosh may be in the driver's seat here. The question to me, though, when we get back to that Northeast region, is can we really build a bracket that goes Virginia, Ohio, and then to Wisconsin without something toward the Northeast? Can we pull all of those Northeastern schools out of region for to not have a Northeastern top 4 seed?
I think it's possible. And so this is what Drew's bringing up is important for everyone to think about. You could have a top 4 that is Randolph-Macon, Marietta, WashU or Illinois Wesleyan, and Oshkosh. That could be a thing. You got to go play with the numbers and take all the teams that could be in it from the Northeast states and see if you can build a bracket where the teams funnel into Marietta and Randolph-Macon. And someone told me the other day that it's definitely doable. So that's it. That's going to be fascinating, is how the committee stacks up like St. Joe against, say, Oshkosh or WashU. That becomes pretty darn fascinating. What do you think about that, Matt Snyder?
Yeah, obviously geography. We know our maps really well come March in Division 3. I'm gonna prepare you, Bob. We're gonna get a bracket of death in that neck of the woods, because the geography, as much as we want it to work out, it's not going to be perfect. If we had our way, I would love to see, Oshkosh and Platteville and maybe La Crosse get first weekend hosts with WashU and Illinois Wesleyan. And I think we're just going to run out of teams. We're going to ship them to Ohio and as much as possible.
But there's a bracket of death coming, isn't there?
Someone is going to go on the road, even in the first weekend. That's not going to be deserving it. And I think there's going to be some hosts on the East Coast, in the Northeast somewhere, and we're going to be questioning it just because of the geography. But I think the 600 miles is going to help. I think we're going to see a very creative bracket. I sunk way too many hours on a bracket that didn't matter a month ago just to kind of play around with it. You can make some really interesting things with 600 miles if the committee is going to want to bus someone 580 miles away. So I don't know if they're going to limit that or just say, let's do it. But it'll be an interesting bracket this year.
It will be. That's what we want everyone to start thinking about is, hey, do you need to have a Northeast host up there or a top seed? Maybe yes, maybe no. It just depends on the criteria. I think the committee can look at the criteria and say, if WashU really has a better resume than St. Joe, maybe WashU geographically could be a host like that. We'll see.
Yeah.
Drew, let's move on to our final region, Region 10, where we get all the land of the misfit toys. And I say that lovingly because Region 10 is, we got our friends out west on the islands. We got our friends in Texas. These teams are all in a tough situation for different reasons in D3 geography land. But Drew, talk us through what you're seeing here in Region 10.
Sure. At the moment, I see Whitworth as the top team in the region. 15-2 record looks pretty good. 540 SOS is solid, especially for somebody that's on a geographic island and in a league that's not as strong, with their rivals Whitman not being at the same level as what we've often seen. And then after that, you look at 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, all from the Southern California Conference. This league has a lot of balance this year. I have been watching for a couple of weeks now of what in the world happens here.
Yeah.
You've got multiple teams that are top 50 type teams, good records. I don't really know who's going to emerge, but I think there's going to be more than one. So I think we've got the potential of at least one Pool C bid out of that league.
Hey,
And
Drew,
then
Whitworth, tell me about Whitworth's 2-1. Off the top of my head, they beat Pomona Pitzer. Did they also beat CMS, or who's that other win? I know they lost to Platteville, but who did Whitworth, Pomona Pitzer, and who?
let me pull it up here.
It was a tournament. Let's see.
Whitewater.
Whitewater. Do you have Whitewater ranked? I think it's CMS. They beat CMS and Pomona Pitzer. That's
they
where
beat. Yeah, they lost to Platteville. They beat CMS. They beat Pomona Pitzer.
Okay, so I'm just trying to see how safe Whitworth is. Do you feel like, Drew, if you go back to your Region 10, so Whitworth 885, I mean, pretty safe. They're at the top of the region. What are you thinking, Matt, Drew? Is Whitworth as a Pool C? Are they a lock or are they bubble-ish? What are you thinking there?
To me, they're on the right side of the bubble right now. I wouldn't use the term lock with them, but I think they're sitting pretty good.
And when we talk about the bubble, there's 20 Pool C teams, and you guys always both talk about this the right way, that there's 20 teams picked, but there's always about 5 or 6 upsets where, like, the Illinois Wesleyans of the world, the locks, all of a sudden become Pool C teams. And they swallow up, I think Drew calls them bid thieves. So there's really not 20 Pool C teams. It's usually more like 14 or 15. Drew, is that what number do you use? Like 13, 14, 15? What do you usually anticipate?
Traditionally, I've used 5 bid thieves, but I will tell you, is I'm looking at that number dynamically right now based on simulations, and at the moment it's sitting at 7. Wow. I'm not sure if that's the uncertainty of tournaments are still a month away, or if there's something wrong with my model. I'd be surprised if we had that many at that point, but right now that's what I'm showing is as many as 7.
So when you hear Matt or Drew talk about someone being like Pool C safe or bubble in, they're not saying that they're like sitting at 19 or 20. They're saying that they're sitting at like 12 or 13.
Yeah,
that exactly is what safe means, right, guys?
Yeah, if I don't think you're in kind of like the top 10 of the Pool C, then to me, I just start talking about the bubble.
And then look, I've been on the bubble. I think Illinois Wesleyan leads the league in Pool C's over the years, if someone could get me that data. But I mean, I've spent many a Saturday and Sunday final weekend grinding out games, teams I've barely ever heard of. Some kid out of nowhere comes off the bench and hits a 3 on you. Yeah. And it's a long day, guys. You don't want to be on the bubble. No. You don't want to be on that bubble at all, because it is tough. I mean, Matt Snyder, you've been on that bubble before, right?
Yeah,
You've grinded
yeah.
out these games, right?
Your team always gets in on the bubble, and
That's
my
true.
team that never gets in on the bubble.
That's a fair statement.
Yeah.
Drew, what else how about the Texas teams? What do we got going on? As a top 25 voter, I can't figure out who to vote for. Tell me, are these Texas teams in Trinity, Texas? That's trouble. 486 SOS, they're in trouble, right? What does this look like in Texas?
Yeah, I think the challenge in Texas is a bit the same as it is in Southern California of go back to the region for a minute. Why does Whitworth likely end up ahead of all of these Southern California teams? Well, look at the final winning percentages. They beat each other up in here, and so those winning percentages drop into the 700s. We see the same thing if we look at this Texas league of there's not a clear winner here, but they're about 5 deep with pretty decent teams, but there's no team that's running away with this. And I fear that they could knock each other out to the point that there is just one team from a pretty decent league here, like we've talked about with the CCIW. This is not historically that powerful league, but nonetheless, there's 4 or 5 teams that a month ago looked like they were going to be pretty solid contenders. And now it's a little bit tougher. So if they continue to pile up the losses on one another by nobody firmly taking control of the league, then I think we're going to see that same kind of issue. Hardin-Simmons goes to Mary Hardin-Baylor later this week. Those kinds of games mean a lot.
Huge.
Other thing to recognize in this league is the entire 8-team tournament is at the number 1 seed.
Yeah. Drew, let's flip back. Here we go. So, when I talk about Texas, obviously the Texas teams are in different conferences. Trinity is in the SCAC. We just talked about the ASC. But if you're looking at this league, Whitworth, the top team, if they were a pool C, it wouldn't be a comfortable Sunday by any stretch. And then once you go lower than that, CMS, Pomona, Pitzer, Chapman, whoever the C's are, those resumes look like Wheaton's resume to me. And we're talking about Wheaton is very bubblish. So this region here is in some trouble in terms of, getting a ton of pool C's, right? Matt, Matt, are you looking at Region 10 the same way?
Yeah, really interested to see how the remainder of the schedule plays out in Southern California. If you have a team that takes control and then loses that conference tournament, I think they would feel pretty good about the Pool C.
Yeah.
If they kind of end up with these so-so resumes come Championship Sunday, that's going to be a long day for them on the bubble. I think Whitworth feels pretty good. I don't know that anyone else on this list will feel great going into selection.
And then there's
Monday.
the geography of this. So once Whitworth is in, you gotta build that bracket they usually build, where you bring Pomona, Pitzer up there and they play, and it's always kind of the same formula. And maybe we can get creative with the bracket. I want to say, was it the last time or the time before? Really cool bracketing. Texas teams are on an island, so you have to do something with the Texas teams and sending them somewhere on the opening weekend. Drew, any final thoughts before we move on from 10 and just talk about a few final thoughts and close this up?
I'll say on Whitworth, I think if they end up where they're predicted here, I feel pretty confident about them, even with the 527 and the 2-1, because the winning percentage is just so
That's
high.
true. 885. Yeah, 885 is, you're right. They would be on the table right away. 885, 527, 2. Yeah, I guess I'm shifting. They would be fine. They would seem to be fine. But I think anyone under them is in the same spot that the Wheatons of the world would be in at that point.
Agreed.
You could stop sharing, Drew. So as we start to wrap this up, first of all, that was super cool. And, I hope everyone else likes that as much as I like listening to you guys talk about that. And I'm just going to ask you guys for some final thoughts here in a second. But again, a huge thanks to be able to do this with the numbers you guys have is off the charts. It is really cool. And I know how much time this takes you guys of your own time, free time, to which you're getting no money or anything out of it except people just appreciating it and using it. So Matt and Drew, I really, on behalf of D3 Hoops Nation, thank you. This is cool stuff. Ask you guys for a final thought and then we'll wrap this thing up. Let's start with Matt Snyder. Matt, final thoughts for the folks watching the QCast.
Yeah, thanks for having us on to talk about it. I enjoy doing this, and I started doing the spreadsheets because I like spreadsheets and I like data, and it was a fun project, right? And there's a ton of nuance that we didn't talk about while going over it fast. So, all these discussions can be had online, and it's fun to interact, to guess, to think what the committee is going to do, to see how they interact. So one of the things I've just appreciated is getting to know you, Bob, and you, Drew, online over these discussions and interacting with the D3 Hoops Nation at large. And it just provides an opportunity for discussion. And I think that's fun.
That's Matt Snyder. Again, you need to follow him on Twitter. It's at FFTMAG, forever faithful to maroon and gold. Is that where that came from?
Yeah. So the Calvin's alma mater, that's a line, that's like one line that everyone knows. They don't know the rest of the words except for kind of that one. So I just kind of picked it and ran with it, and maybe I can use Drew's marketing people, because D3 bubble rolls off the tongue.
Oh, that's
a lot better.
Tremendous handle. At FFTMAG is Matt Snyder. And Drew, your final thoughts for those tuning in here today.
Yeah, likewise, a real pleasure to get to talk with both of you guys. I know the three of us, along with a handful of others, Dave McHugh and Pat and Ryan Whitnable and others have talked for years, but we very rarely get to run into each other. Even when Worcester and Illinois Wesleyan have played in the NCAA tournament multiple times, we've never been in the right place.
That's right.
To get to chat in person. And so appreciate both of you. And, as somebody that's part of a D3 community on a daily basis, it's just a lot of fun to be able to participate in some small way and in what's happening around the conversation, and to help give a little bit of the publicity that these great student athletes at this level deserve to have.
Guys, I can't thank you enough. Drew can be found at D3 Bubble, and both of these guys just have outstanding data and content, and their tweets are awesome. So every morning I look forward to what they've got going, and they have a pretty steady stream of stuff this time of year. Drew, Matt, you guys are the best. Thank you so much. And I think people are going to get a ton out of what you've brought to us today. So thank you so much, guys. And let's do this again pretty soon. Okay.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Thanks, you, Bob.
Guys.
Thank you, Matt.